My name is Jordan, I'm 31 years old, and this is the story I never thought I'd tell. It's not one of those rags to riches fairy tales. It's messier, darker, and far too real. If you're watching or reading this, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Not for me, but for what this story might teach you about pride, betrayal, and the quiet way revenge sometimes writes itself. That afternoon, the house smelled like old wood and arguments. Our family home was too big for peace. The kind of place where every word echoed longer than it should, bouncing down hallways filled with memories that should have stayed buried. I had come back because Mom wasn't doing well. Her health had been declining for months, and despite everything, the past fights, the unspoken grudges, I couldn't just abandon her. My older brother Elias lived there too. He'd always been the golden child, the one who made it. The one Dad used to brag about at every dinner table while pretending I was invisible. Elias ran a small logistics company, not a huge empire but enough to make him feel like a king in a small kingdom. He had the money, the car, the watch that flashed too bright under the kitchen light. And me. I had nothing to show for my 31 years except debts and dreams that never fully came to life. I was a graphic designer who'd been laid off after my firm downsized. The kind of freelancer who worked more hours than anyone but still couldn't pay rent on time. That day, I stood in the kitchen, staring at the half-empty loaf of bread, thinking about how symbolic it was. The last thing we hadn't yet argued about. Elias walked in with that smug smile, the one that always came before a wound. He poured himself a glass of juice, leaned against the counter, and looked at me like I was some charity case he wished he didn't have to see. "Still here?" he asked, pretending it was a joke. "Yeah," I said, not looking up. He chuckled. "You know, Jordan, you're 31. Most men your age can at least afford a piece of bread." The words landed harder than I wanted to admit. Mom, sitting in the living room, pretended not to hear, but I saw her shoulders tighten. I didn't argue. I didn't even look at him. I just smiled, that quiet, tired smile that hides both pain and promise, and walked away. That night, I lay awake in my old room, staring at the cracks on the ceiling. They used to look like shapes when I was a kid. Dragons, islands, clouds. Now they just looked like broken paths. Elias's laughter echoed faintly down the hall. He was probably on a call, bragging again about a new client or a new contract. He lived for those moments, for being seen, admired, envied. I'd grown up envying him too. Until that day. Because that was the day I decided, silently, that I'd stop asking life for mercy. I wasn't going to argue anymore. I wasn't going to explain myself to anyone, least of all him. But I was going to change everything. A week later, Elias called me nonstop. By then, things had already started to shift. Quietly, invisibly. Began with a job. Or rather, an opportunity. A man I'd once designed a logo for. Someone who'd left an impression for all the wrong reasons. Reached out with an offer. His name was Victor Lane. He ran a security firm, but it wasn't the kind that guarded malls or banks. Victor dealt in digital security, data recovery, breach containment, sometimes darker things. He remembered me. Said he liked the precision in my design work, how I saw patterns. He needed someone with a sharp eye, someone who could handle sensitive information without blinking. First I said no. I didn't trust him. He didn't seem like the kind of man you say yes to without consequences. But when my landlord called to remind me that kindness doesn't pay rent, I called Victor back. And that's when the story really began. Working for Victor was like stepping behind a curtain I didn't know existed. The world looked the same from the outside, but the rules underneath it were entirely different. He gave me access to systems that shouldn't have been accessible. Emails, financial accounts, networks. My job was to analyze vulnerabilities, but what I discovered was much bigger. Elias's name popped up one night while I was running a sweep on local business transactions. His company had been quietly taking government contracts, small ones at first, then larger, and hiding money through a web of shell accounts. He wasn't just successful, he was dirty. And suddenly everything made sense. The arrogance, the ease, the casual cruelty. He wasn't better. He was just better at lying. I spent 3 nights barely sleeping, torn between anger and disbelief. I wanted to confront him, scream, tell him I knew everything. But then I remembered his laughter, the way he'd said, "You can't even afford a piece of bread." That laughter became fuel. So when he called me, desperate, panicked, 7 days later I didn't answer. He called again, and again, 12 missed calls, then 21. Finally a message. "Jordan, please, I need to talk to you. It's urgent." I stared at it, my pulse steady, almost calm. Then I typed back, "No more bread," and hit send. I didn't feel triumph. Not yet. Just silence, the kind that comes right before thunder. Because I knew what was happening on his end. I had already set things in motion. A quiet, intricate unraveling that would strip him down to what he once called me. Nothing. You see, revenge doesn't always arrive with blood or violence. Sometimes it wears patience like armor. And mine was just getting started. When I hit send, no more bread, a small private part of me expected relief, like ripping off a bandage. Instead I felt the long, slow pull of something vast beginning to move. Victor had told me once that every system has a skeleton, the hidden rails that make things stand up. He said if you found the rails you could make a building lean. I had found Elias's rails. The first week after my message was a lesson in restraint. Elias's calls kept coming in, frantic and increasingly unhinged. He left voicemails that started polite and swerved into raw panic. Promises, threats, pleas. Once he even begged, voice cracking. "Please, speak to me, Jordan. Whatever it is, we can fix it. You and me for Mom." For a moment I nearly listened. I pictured Mom in the bedroom, eyes fogged, smiling when she heard her boys arguing the way they always had. But then I remembered the half-loaf, the way he'd leaned on the counter like he owned the air in the room. I remembered the decades of small cruelties that built up so quietly they became unassailable. This was not about bread. This was about everything he'd stolen from me over the years. Dignity, chance, the quiet belief that I deserved respect. Victor and I worked fast and almost surgically. He showed me how to nudge accounts, how to create little hiccups that appeared accidental. The first nudge was clever and petty. Exactly the kind of thing that would humiliate him without producing blood. I set up a scheduled payment to a charity in his name. Not a big donation. Just enough to be noticed by someone who watched his accounts for vanity metrics. Showed up on a public donor list. Elias called, red-faced, and asked if he'd been hacked. I let the silence stretch before answering. Maybe someone's doing you a favor. But I didn't want to be petty forever. Petty is cheap and easily forgiven. I wanted the kind of retribution that made people pay attention, that forced them to look at what they'd done and at the fragile scaffolding they'd built their lives upon. Victor called it strategic exposure. I called it letting truth find its audience. We started slowly. A few invoices flagged, a temporary freeze on transfer authorizations, emails rerouted to an alias so that private comments he'd made to clients surfaced in places he couldn't control. I watched him scramble like a man learning the rules for the first time. He hired a lawyer. He stormed through the house, slamming doors and demanding to know who was doing this. He accused neighbors, vendors, even Mom for not telling him sooner. He accused me once, during a moment of rage that made him look smaller than I ever remembered. "You did this," he spat. "You and that, what's his name, Victor?" I didn't correct him. I let him believe whatever version of the story suited him best. Belief is a warm thing. People clutch it when everything else is cold. The louder his panic grew, the more I tightened the net. I found a ledger, a spreadsheet lost in an old backup, that tied his contracts to shell companies and to a man with an alias who'd been siphoning funds overseas. The evidence was messy and deliberate. Elias had spent years making sure no one would see the pattern. He'd built a map of lies and buried the path between the marks. But the map exists if you are willing to follow paper trails and old emails and the way people talk when they forget they're being watched. I didn't leak the entire map at once. That would have been too clean. Instead, I allowed details to leak to the right ears in the right sequence. A whisper here to a small local newspaper about suspicious bidding on municipal contracts. A forwarded invoice to a disgruntled former partner who loved drama and had a podcast. A cryptic email to a regulator with an attached file that made the numbers look ugly. Public shame is a slow poison. It seeps into reputation, which in Elias's world was currency. Within a month there were articles. Small investigative pieces about companies that won bids in irregular patterns. Friends called him. Clients asked questions they had no business asking and suddenly were entitled to answers. He began to lose contracts with a sort of careful, polite emails that thinly veiled relief. "We're reallocating resources. Best of luck." Everywhere he turned, someone else had a better excuse to walk away. Mom sat in the middle of this like a lighthouse in fog. She would listen to the radio and mutter, "They say his name." Her voice was small. Once, when Elias stormed in with a travel bag, "I'm going to fix this," he declared, which was code for running to the people who could quiet scandals for a price. He paused in the doorway at the sight of her. For a second, the mask slid and something like shame crossed his face. He touched her hand and said, "I'll make this right." I watched them both and felt not triumph but a strange, aching pity. He would try to fix things the way he always had, by throwing money at problems and pretending he'd always been generous. He called me one night from a hotel room, voice hoarse. "Jordan," he said, softer now. "I don't know what's happening. Someone's trying to ruin me. If you know something, tell me." Mom's worried. She said, "You said, no more bread. Jordan, come home. Help me. Please." I pictured the hotel ceiling. Imagined him staring at cracks that probably looked the same as the ones in my old room. I imagined him pacing in a suit that had never known real dirt. All those years of hurt and I still, irrationally, stubbornly, cared about him. That's how siblings are. We carry, beneath our resentments, a kind of tether built from shared birthday cakes and scraped knees and the smell of boiled rice at midnight. But I had learned that the tether could strangle as easily as it could tether. I said nothing for a long time. When I finally spoke, it was a small, decisive whisper. "You made this bed, Elias. You lied for years. You can sleep in it." He cried then. I could hear it in the phone line. The short, shocked breaths of a man who had always believed his net was unbreakable. Maybe he understood for the first time that the scaffolding he'd erected was wooden and played by rules that might be traced back to him. The fallout accelerated. Regulatory audits were scheduled. A partner testified about irregular payments. The man with the alias, the one who'd funneled money, quietly moved countries. It was the kind of thing that would have required months of quiet digging for any journalist. We had curated it like a terrible art show, placing each piece carefully where it would be seen. Even so, nothing I did felt clean. Revenge is not righteousness. It's a slow, ugly exhalation that leaves invisible stains. Sometimes I woke up and felt sick to my stomach, like I'd swallowed something I didn't know how to get rid of. The line between justice and cruelty blurred in ways that made me wary. Victor would call occasionally, his voice clinical, reminding me of the rules. Minimize collateral damage, avoid real harm, focus on reputational exposure, not violence, and I would agree. But agreement didn't abolish the consequences. One evening, as the story splashed into state-level coverage, Elias came to the house without warning. He looked smaller than before, or maybe the world around him had grown larger. Mom was in her chair, a blanket across her knees. He stood for a moment at the doorway and then, like a man returning to a cratered city, moved in. "Jordan," he said, and there was something in his voice that was new, fatigue. "We used to fight about stupid things. Bread. Here's who got the last piece of cake. I never thought it would get like this. I wanted to say, you made it like this." I wanted to list his betrayals like a shopping list of sins. But as much as anger burned inside me, the sight of him, hollowed out by panic and regret, put a new kind of coal into the fire. He sat across from me, hands shaking, and then he did something I hadn't expected. He apologized. "I'm sorry," he said, and it sounded real in a way I'd never heard. "For the things I said. For how I treated you. For being proud when I should have been kind. The words were a scalpel and a salve. It would have been easy to accept, to weave this apology into a story where everything is redeemed. But for me, apologies have always been cheaper than repair. Saying sorry does not erase the ledger. It does not fill the holes you hollowed in someone's life. I listened and felt the past colliding with the present. I thought of Mom's hands, the way she had held mine when I was 7. I thought of the slights that had accumulated like lint. I remembered the loaf of bread and the way he'd laughed when he said I couldn't afford it. He waited, eyes pleading. "Please," he said again. "Help me." For a moment I floated between two choices, mercy and consequence. Mercy would be to reach out, to shield him with an embrace, to let the world smooth over yesterdays. Consequence would be the truth, revealed, public, and inescapable. Victor sat at the edge of my resolve like a quiet, dark advisor. Don't let emotion undercut the work. I let silence do the work for me. When I spoke, my voice was low. You can apologize, Elias. You can try to be a better man. But you can't buy back what you took. People have to know. He looked like he wanted to argue, to bargain, to pull old tricks. Instead he bowed his head. Then do what you must, he whispered. Just don't let Mom suffer. That was the line I promised to protect. Not because Elias deserved any clemency, but because Mom did. I pulled back from the edge where vindication and cruelty meet. I made sure our actions, Victor's and mine, were surgical. We avoided anything that would harm Mom directly. We limited the public spectacle in ways that mattered to her dignity. It was a moral accounting that didn't absolve me, but it kept me from becoming the monster Elias had always said I was. The days that followed were a fog of hearings, angry meetings, and the slow collapse of a life that had seemed bulletproof. I watched Elias unravel and rebuild in public, a man crafting apologies for cameras and constructing defenses against regulators. He lost clients, friends, and the brittle piece of a reputation he'd bought. He learned the sound of silence in rooms that used to applaud him. And through it all, a curious thing happened. The man under the posture began to emerge. Without his shields, there were glimpses of someone who could be something other than a predator. Sometimes late at night I caught him in the kitchen making tea for Mom. Hands awkward and clumsy, the way people touch things when they are learning tenderness for the first time. I didn't know then whether redemption is possible. Maybe it is. Maybe punishment and forgiveness can coexist like two wrong sides of the same coin. But one thing I knew with an absolute clarity that surprised me. The breadline, the moment when he laughed and called me useless, had been the fulcrum. It had shifted me in ways I couldn't unshift. I had reached for something neither of us could name at the time. Not just retribution, but a reclaiming of self that said I would no longer be the butt of jokes, the invisible brother in a house that remembered only the loudest voices. When Mom's eyes met mine that night, she didn't ask what I'd done. She only touched my hand, a small, steady weight. "You're my son," she said, as if that explained everything, and maybe it did. Elias didn't disappear quietly. That wasn't his nature. He'd always been a fighter, even when the war was lost, even when the ground beneath him had already given way. For weeks, I watched him try to resurrect the ruins. He hired a crisis PR team, recorded apologetic interviews with trembling sincerity, and posted half-hearted motivational quotes online about rising stronger from adversity. It was surreal. The same man who once called me useless now publicly repenting for mismanagement and oversight. But behind the scenes, I could see the storm building again. He wasn't done. He started digging into me. I noticed it first when my email password stopped working. Then when a call came from my bank about suspicious login attempts. Victor confirmed my fears. Someone was trying to trace my activity. I didn't need a confession to know who. Elias had finally realized that the invisible hand pulling the strings was close to home. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe he'd always known deep down that I was capable of more than silence. I didn't panic though. Not immediately. I'd planned for this. I'd left no direct trail, every move layered behind proxies and aliases. Still, there's something unsettling about being hunted by someone who knows you too well. Elias had the same stubborn mind as me, the same refusal to give up once cornered. One night, around 2 a.m., I heard a car pull up in front of the house. The headlights sliced through my curtains like interrogation lamps. Then a knock. Sharp. Steady. When I opened the door, Elias stood there. He looked older, not by years but by weight. His tie was undone, hair disheveled, and his eyes had that bloodshot glaze of a man who hadn't slept for days. He didn't wait for an invitation. He just walked past me into the living room. "Mom's asleep," I said quietly. "I'm not here for her," he shot back. His voice was calm in that dangerous, brittle way, like glass before it shatters. He turned to me. "You did this." I didn't answer. He stepped closer. "Don't lie to me, Jordan. You've always hated me. You wanted to see me fall. Congratulations, you got what you wanted." There it was, the confession dressed as accusation. The old Elias, needing to control the narrative even when it was burning around him. I stared at him, searching for something. Regret, humility, anything that resembled truth. But all I saw was desperation. "You think this fixes anything," he hissed. "You think ruining me makes you better. You don't know what you've done. You've destroyed our name, Mom's name. Everything Dad built." I felt the word dad like a cold slap. Our father had been gone 10 years, but his ghost still ruled the house. The ghost of his expectations, his favoritism, his invisible ledger of pride. "Dad built this," I said quietly. "No, Elias. You built this mess. You built it on lies." He sneered, stepping closer. "You always talk about lies, but you've been hiding your whole life, blaming everyone else for your failures. You couldn't even afford bread, remember that." Something in me snapped, just slightly, the part that had promised to stay calm. I took a slow breath, forcing my hands to stay still. "Yeah," I said. "I remember. And I also remember what you said after that. That I'd never be anything." I met his eyes, unwavering. "Guess what, Elias? I became something you never thought I could be. The consequence." He froze. For a second, I thought he'd lunge at me. But instead, his shoulders sagged, a strange mix of defeat and disbelief. "You're proud of this," he whispered. "You've turned into the very thing you used to hate in me." The words lingered, heavy and quiet. Then he left. No threats, no shouting. Just walked out into the night like a man walking into a storm without an umbrella. The next morning, Mom noticed. She could always feel tension like a change in the weather. "What happened last night?" she asked softly. "Nothing," I lied. She gave me that long, knowing look that only mothers have, the kind that says, "I know you're lying, but I'll let you keep your secret until you're ready." For the rest of that week, the house was quieter than usual. The kind of quiet that makes you think the walls are listening. Then one evening I got a call. Not from Elias but from Victor. "You need to see this," he said. He sent me a link. Video. It was Elias, standing outside his office building, reporters swarming him. His voice trembled as he spoke. "I take full responsibility for the financial irregularities. But I wasn't alone. Someone close to me orchestrated part of this." Then he looked directly into the camera. "My brother." My chest tightened. Victor sighed on the other end of the line. "He's trying to turn the story around. He's desperate. He can't prove anything, but he's lighting fires in every direction." And he did. Within hours, my name started circulating on social media. Whispers, half-truths, speculation. Brother sabotage. Family betrayal. Some called me a whistleblower, others called me a leech. It didn't matter which side they picked. I was now part of the spectacle. That night, I sat alone on the porch, the phone buzzing nonstop beside me. It was strange. For so long, I'd dreamed of reclaiming my voice, of finally being seen after years of being overshadowed. Now that it felt like standing under a spotlight that burned. Mom came out quietly, wrapped in her shawl. She sat next to me without a word. After a long silence, she said, "You know, when you boys were little, Elias used to hold your hand crossing the street. He was terrified you'd get lost. I smiled faintly. Yeah, that was a long time ago. She nodded. Still, I think part of him believes he's protecting you now, even if he's doing it the wrong way. Her words sank into me like stones. Maybe she was right. Maybe Elias didn't even understand what he'd become, or what I had. Revenge doesn't just destroy the guilty. It eats everyone standing close enough to feel its heat. Days turned into weeks. The investigation deepened. The truth, the real truth, eventually surfaced through official channels. Elias's paper trail was undeniable, and my involvement remained unproven. The media shifted its focus elsewhere, hungry for a new scandal. But the damage between us was permanent. Elias lost everything: the company, the house, the reputation. He sold his car, liquidated what he could, and moved out of town. We spoke only once more before he left. He came to see Mom to say goodbye. I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to wash dishes. When he turned to leave, he paused by the door and looked at me. "Congratulations," he said softly. "You got your bread." There was no anger in his voice, just emptiness. The kind that comes after the fire has burned out and there's nothing left to save. I didn't respond. I didn't even look up. When the door closed, I exhaled, but it didn't feel like relief. Felt like an echo. Weeks later, Mom passed away quietly in her sleep. Her last words to me were simple: "Take care of each other." There was irony in that, maybe even grace. Because by then, each other was all that was left of what used to be a family. And though I never saw Elias again, I heard from Victor months later that he'd started working at a small construction firm under a different name. Not rich, not famous, but alive. I sometimes imagine him there, covered in dust and sweat, maybe even laughing again. Not the cruel kind of laughter, but the human kind that comes from surviving. And me. I stayed behind in the old house, still designing, still rebuilding, still learning that sometimes revenge isn't a full stop. It's a comma before the next sentence of your life. When people ask if I regret what I did, I tell them the truth. But I understand now that revenge doesn't end the story. It just changes its tone. Because at the end of it all, Elias was right about one thing. I did finally afford bread. I just never imagined the cost would taste like ashes. The house became too quiet after Mom's funeral. It's strange how silence can make walls feel alive, how a floorboard creak or a sigh of wind can sound like a memory whispering. I stayed in the family home longer than I meant to. Maybe because leaving felt like erasing her. Maybe because the ghost of what happened still needed an audience. Elias never came to the funeral. He sent flowers, white lilies, with a simple note that read, "She deserved better sons." I stared at those words for a long time. Better sons. It wasn't even anger I felt. It was something deeper, heavier. A tired kind of grief that didn't know where to settle. Victor called a few days later. "You did what you set out to do," he said. "Elias is out of the picture. His accounts are frozen, his company dissolved. They're clean. You can move on now." Move on. Sounded simple enough. But how do you move on from something that redefined who you are? I had built my revenge like a sculpture. Patient, deliberate, precise. Every move calculated, every emotion harnessed. And now that it was done, all that remained was the hollow space it had once occupied. I didn't tell Victor that sometimes I missed the fire. Because the truth is, revenge gives you purpose. And when the purpose dies, it leaves behind silence. And silence has a way of echoing too loud in your head. A month passed before I heard from Elias again. It started with an email, short, almost hesitant. "You win. Understand now. But there's something you should know." Attached was a single document. Bank statement. At first I didn't see what he meant. Just numbers, account references, old transactions. Then my eyes caught it. A deposit made under my name 2 years ago. I frowned. It was a large sum, too large, listed as consulting reimbursement. I had never received it. But the source, Elias's company. And the date, it was right before his biggest government contract. I scrolled through the records again. My stomach tightened. It wasn't a payment to me. It was a transaction in my name. Someone had used my details as part of his shell web. That's when I realized something awful. He hadn't been lying entirely when he said I'd helped him. I wasn't complicit, not intentionally, but my freelance designs, those invoices I'd sent him years ago for small work. He'd used them to launder part of his fake expenses. He'd made it look like I was one of his vendors. My name, my account, my business license. All part of the records now being investigated. It wasn't revenge that destroyed Elias. It was Elias's own mistakes. I had only accelerated the exposure. But now that web had reached me too. I spent the next week trying to untangle it. I called Victor. He analyzed the documents, confirmed they were real. You're technically in the system, he said. If anyone looks closely, they'll think you were part of it. I swallowed hard. Can we fix it? He was silent for a moment. We can bury it, but it'll cost you. In more ways than one. That's when I realized something else. Victor's tone wasn't neutral anymore. There was an edge to it, almost possessive. He had helped me out of his own motives, not loyalty. He liked control, power. And now that I owed him, he wasn't about to let go. You'll owe me, Jordan, he said. But we can keep you clean. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent months orchestrating someone's downfall, and now I was the one trapped in someone else's hands. Revenge had flipped the mirror. The next morning, I sat in the same kitchen where Elias had once laughed at me. The same counter where he'd said those words that started everything. I looked at the bread box. Empty now, dusty. I remembered the first insult, the quiet humiliation. I remembered my smile as I walked away. And I realized, that moment hadn't just broken me. It had built someone new. Someone who didn't flinch, but also didn't recognize peace anymore. I picked up my phone and scrolled through old photos. Mom smiling, Elias holding me as a kid, our family dinners. We looked normal. Happy even. If someone told me back then that one of us would destroy the other, I would have laughed. But life has a strange way of folding people inward until all you see are the parts that hurt most. By the end of that week, I did something reckless. I got in my car and drove 3 hours north, to the address Victor had once mentioned Elias was living under. A small town, mostly industrial, nothing glamorous. I didn't even know what I wanted, closure maybe. Or confession. Or just to see what kind of man my brother had become after the storm. When I found him, he was working on a construction site. Jeans, safety vest, dirt on his face. He saw me before I called his name. His eyes widened, then softened. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he said quietly, "You shouldn't be here. I needed to see you." He nodded, wiping his hands on his vest. "You saw what you came for." I hesitated, then handed him the printed bank statement. "Why didn't you tell me before? You used my name." He exhaled slowly, shame flickering across his face. "I didn't think it mattered back then. I was trying to cover gaps. I never thought it'd come back to you." "Well, it has," I said. "They're going to find it." He looked at me, something unreadable in his expression. "Maybe they should. What does that mean?" "It means maybe this is what it takes for both of us to stop pretending we're victims." The words hit harder than I expected. He stepped closer. "I blamed you for my downfall. You blamed me for your pain. But we both made choices. Maybe Mom was right. We destroy each other because we're too alike." For a second, I almost hated how right he sounded. We stood there, two men who'd lost everything trying to measure what was left. Then he said something I didn't expect. "You can tell the truth, Jordan. If they ask, tell them everything. Let it end cleanly. Let it end right." I stared at him. "You're willing to take the fall." He smiled sadly. "I already did." He turned and walked back toward the half-built structure. His silhouette fading into the dust and sunlight. That was the last time I saw him. A few months later, the investigation quietly closed. My name never appeared in the final reports. Victor handled the cleanup and I never asked how. But every time I sent him a payment, a small piece of my freedom handed over in installments, I thought of Elias's last words. Let it end cleanly. And maybe it had. At least on paper. But in reality, revenge doesn't end. It just sleeps. Sometimes I still hear Elias's laughter in my dreams, mixed with Mom's voice calling us to dinner. Sometimes I wake up with that same quiet smile I wore the day it all began. People online still ask about the story when I post small updates. They call it poetic justice, karma, even inspirational. I let them believe what they want. Because truth is heavier than storytelling. And if you've made it this far, if you've listened to my story and found yourself cheering for revenge, then maybe deep down you already know. Revenge isn't about winning. It's about surviving your own reflection. So yes, I texted him no more bread. But what I really meant was no more hunger. Not for power. Not for validation. Not even for forgiveness. Just peace, the kind you don't have to steal.